The dust of Harmony Creek settled on everything, a fine, pale powder that clung to hope and choked it dead. Thomas Brennan felt it in his throat as he watched his daughter Lucy chase a butterfly down the bustling boardwalk. At 6 years old, she was a whirlwind of pigtails and laughter, a bright spark against the town's weary sun-bleached clapboard. His wife Margaret stood beside him, her hand resting in the crook of his arm, a point of serene stillness in the chaotic street. Her smile was the only thing the dust couldn't touch. "She has your spirit." Thomas Margaret murmured, her voice a soft melody against the clamor of wagon wheels and farriers' hammers. A stubborn refusal to be tamed. Thomas squeezed her hand. "And your grace, thank heavens. Otherwise she'd be a menace to the entire territory." They were happy here. He'd left his life as a lawman behind trading the weight of a badge for the simple, profound peace of a family. He'd seen enough of the darkness that lurked in the hearts of men and wanted Lucy to grow up knowing only the light. Harmony Creek was meant to be their sanctuary, a place where the name Thomas Brennan meant husband and father, not the man who'd faced down the worst the West could offer. That peace shattered at precisely 10 minutes past noon. The sound was not a single gunshot, but a volley, a percussive roar that tore through the fabric of the day. People screamed. Horses reared their whinnies, sharp with terror. From the doors of the Harmony Creek Bank, 5 men spilled out their faces, obscured by grimy bandanas, their hands filled with pistols and canvas bags heavy with stolen hope. Instinct buried but not dead surged through Thomas. He pushed Margaret and Lucy behind him, his body a shield, his eyes scanning for angles for cover, for a weapon he no longer carried. He was helpless, a lawman without a gun, a protector with nothing but his own flesh to offer. The gang's leader, a tall man with a cruel confidence in his stride, barked orders, his voice a gravelly sneer that cut through the panic. "Nobody plays the hero," he yelled, waving a silver-inlaid revolver. "This is progress, folks. Wealth redistributed." The men fanned out their movements, practiced and brutal. One of them fired into the air, and the crowd scrambled back, a wave of terror clearing the street. Thomas saw his opening, a narrow alley between the general store and the assayer's office. He grabbed Margaret's hand, his other arm around Lucy's small shoulders. "This way. Now." They moved as one, a small, desperate unit in a world gone mad. But in the chaos, a stray horse, its reins broken, and its eyes wild with fear, bolted directly into their path. Thomas shoved his family aside, taking the brunt of the animal's charge. He stumbled, falling hard against a water trough, the world spinning in a dizzying flash of pain and splintered wood. He looked up just in time to see the worst moment of his life unfold. Margaret, momentarily separated from him, stood frozen, her arms wrapped protectively around a crying Lucy. One of the bandits, young and jittery, swung his pistol toward them, perhaps spooked by the horse, perhaps by Margaret's defiant stare. The bank leader saw it too. "No," he shouted, but it was too late. The jittery bandit's gun bucked in his hand. The crack of the pistol was flat ugly. A small dark hole appeared on the crisp white fabric of Margaret's dress, just below her collarbone. Her eyes widened, not in pain, but in sheer, heartbreaking surprise. She looked at Thomas, her lips forming his name, a silent question he could never answer. Then she collapsed, a marionette with its strings cut, pulling Lucy down with her in a final protective embrace. Time stopped. The sounds of the street, the shouting, the screams, all faded into a dull, roaring silence in Thomas's ears. He saw only Margaret, her life seeping into the thirsty dust of Harmony Creek. He scrambled to his feet, a guttural cry of pure animal agony tearing from his throat. The gang leader, the man with the silver revolver, paused. His eyes, cold and dark above his bandana, met Thomas's. For a heartbeat, there was something other than malice in that gaze, a flicker of shock, maybe even regret. He took a step toward Margaret's body, his attention drawn to the glint of silver at her throat. It was a locket, a simple oval of polished silver on a delicate chain. Thomas had given it to her on their wedding day, a Brennan family heirloom passed down through 3 generations. Inside, were tiny hand-painted portraits of himself and a baby Lucy. With a swift, callous motion, the leader bent down, ripped the locket from Margaret's neck, and shoved it into his pocket. He didn't look at her face. He didn't look at the sobbing child clinging to her lifeless form. He looked only at Thomas, a final wordless message passing between them. "I have taken everything from you." Then he was gone, mounting his horse and disappearing with his men in a cloud of dust and stolen dreams. The world rushed back in a cacophony of grief. Thomas crawled to Margaret, his hands shaking so violently he could barely touch her. Lucy was wailing, her small hands covered in her mother's blood. He pulled his daughter into his arms, burying his face in her hair, but his eyes never left the spot where his wife lay. The dust was already beginning to settle on her, claiming her, turning her into just another part of the unforgiving landscape. In that moment, Thomas Brennan died, and something else, something cold and hard and patient, was born from his ashes. He would find the man with the silver locket. He would find him, and he would burn his world to the ground. 5 years later, the man who was once Thomas Brennan rode into the desolate town of Silver Ridge. He was called Tex, now a name whispered like a curse across the territory. The 5 years had been a brutal education. He had learned that to hunt a monster, you had to become one. He had tracked down whispers of the gang, piecing together their movements, their habits, their leader's name, Silas Crenshaw. And in a desperate, twisted act of proximity to his own past, he had joined them. He had made himself so useful, so ruthlessly efficient, that he had become Crenshaw's top enforcer. It was a slow, soul-crushing form of poison, working for the man who had destroyed his life. But it was the only way. Crenshaw trusted no one, and never spoke of the past. Tex had to wait to watch for the one thing that would confirm his suspicions, for the glint of a stolen silver locket. Silver Ridge was a town dying on its feet. Crenshaw was buying it out piece by agonizing piece, clearing the way for the railroad that would make him richer and more powerful than ever. Tex's job was to be the shadow that preceded Crenshaw's offers, the chilling promise of what would happen if anyone refused. He didn't have to draw his gun. His reputation did the killing for him. The town's fear was a physical presence. Dust settled in the saloon's empty chairs, a gray shroud over faded velvet. The creak of a sign swinging in the wind was the only sound on Main Street, a lonely metronome marking the town's slow demise. Faces that appeared in windows vanished like ghosts the moment his horse trod the packed earth. Tex had learned to read this fear, to cultivate it. It was his armor and his weapon. Only one property remained outside Crenshaw's grasp, a small stubborn homestead at the edge of town, owned by a widow named Helen McKinnon. She and her young daughter were the last holdouts, a solitary snag in the river of Crenshaw's ambition. Her husband, a former deputy named James, had died a year ago under circumstances the townsfolk preferred not to discuss, a sudden illness that had come on too fast, too conveniently, right after he'd started asking questions about Crenshaw's land acquisitions. Crenshaw's new headquarters was the old town hall, the grandest building in Silver Ridge, its faded grandeur now a monument to his ego. Tex dismounted and entered without knocking. Silas Crenshaw sat behind the mayor's enormous oak desk, polishing a silver cigar case, a picture of refined menace. He was handsome in a severe way, his dark hair streaked with gray at the temples, his suits always impeccably tailored, a stark contrast to the grit and grime of the world he conquered. Thomas Crenshaw said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. He was the only one who still used that name, a subtle reminder of the control he held. "Any news from our stubborn widow?" "She's not selling," Tex replied, his own voice a low rasp, scraped raw by disuse and dust. Crenshaw sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. Persistence is an admirable quality, but in this case, it is merely an obstacle to progress. He looked up, his eyes sharp and intelligent. "Thomas, persuade the widow. Use your..." reputation. Remind her that progress, like a river, washes away all that stands in its path. We wouldn't want her to drown. The veiled threat was clear. Tex nodded, once his face an unreadable mask. He had delivered 100 such messages, his presence alone enough to curdle a man's courage. But this time, something felt different. Perhaps it was the thought of threatening a widow and her child, a grim echo of a past he could never escape. He turned to leave his heart, a cold, heavy stone in his chest. This was the price of his vengeance. He had to destroy lives to get close to the man who had destroyed his. The McKinnon homestead was a small pocket of defiance in a landscape of surrender. A white picket fence in need of paint enclosed a modest but well-tended garden. Marigolds and zinnias bloomed in a riot of color, a stark contrast to the town's monochrome despair. As Tex approached, a woman emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. Helen McKinnon was not what he had expected. There was a weariness in her eyes, but it was overlaid with a quiet strength that reminded him painfully of Margaret. "I know who you are," she said, her voice steady, though her hands were clenched tightly at her sides. "And I know who sent you." Tex stopped at the gate. He felt the weight of his reputation, of the monster he had become. "Mr. Crenshaw has made you a generous offer for this land, ma'am. This land is all I have left of my husband." Helen's voice was low, fierce. "It's all my daughter has left of her father. You can tell Mr. Crenshaw he'll get it when he pries it from my cold, dead hands." Her defiance was like a physical blow. He had expected fear tears, a reluctant signature on a deed. He had not expected this raw, unyielding courage. He opened his mouth to deliver the threat Crenshaw had armed him with, but the words wouldn't come. It was then that the screen door creaked open, and a little girl stepped out onto the porch. She couldn't have been more than 7, with bright, curious eyes and a smattering of freckles across her nose. She held a small, hand-carved wooden horse in one hand. She looked at Tex, not with fear, but with an unnerving, innocent scrutiny. She reminded him so much of Lucy that it stole the air from his lungs. Ignoring her mother's sharp intake of breath, the girl walked to the edge of the porch. "You look thirsty," she said simply, her voice clear as a bell. She pointed to a pump near the garden. "We have cool water." Then she held up the wooden horse. "And you look sad." The observation, so direct and true, cracked the hardened exterior he had spent 5 years building. Sad. No one had called him sad. They called him a devil, a killer, a monster. But this child, with eyes that saw too much, saw the grief he had tried to bury under layers of violence and hate. She saw Thomas Brennan. He stood there frozen, the unspoken threat dying on his lips. The little girl, Rosie, just watched him waiting. Her simple act of kindness, the offer of water, and the acknowledgement of his pain was a more formidable weapon than any gun. It was the first crack in the armor, the first light to pierce a darkness that had lasted 5 agonizing years. He couldn't do it. He couldn't threaten this woman and this child. He turned without another word and walked away, the image of a small wooden horse burned into his mind. He had failed his mission, but for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel like a monster. He felt like a man who had just been handed a splinter of hope. Tex rode back to town, the child's words echoing in his mind. "You look sad." He had forgotten the shape of that emotion, replacing it with the sharp, clean burn of rage. Sadness was a vulnerability, a weakness he couldn't afford. He walked into Crenshaw's office, the lie already formed on his lips. "She's thinking on it." Tex said, his voice flat. "Needs a day or 2. Crenshaw studied him, his gaze analytical. Tex met his stare without flinching, his face a mask of indifference. For 5 years he had lived a lie, and his control was absolute. Finally, Crenshaw nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Very well. But progress waits for no woman's indecision. See that she makes the right choice. Soon. But Crenshaw was not a man who left things to chance. That night, under the cold, indifferent light of a sliver moon, Tex watched from the shadows of a livery stable as two of Crenshaw's thugs, a pair of greasy hardcases named Jeb and Silas, slipped out of town on horseback. They rode in the direction of the McKinnon homestead. Tex's blood ran cold. He knew their purpose as surely as if Crenshaw had given him the order himself. If persuasion failed, contamination would suffice. A poisoned well would drive the widow off her land faster than any threat. The monster he had crafted over 5 years warred with the man he used to be. The monster whispered that this was necessary, a small price for the ultimate goal of vengeance. Let them suffer. It brings you one step closer to Crenshaw, one step closer to the locket. But the man, the ghost of Thomas Brennan, saw a woman of courage and a little girl with kind eyes. He saw Margaret and Lucy. He saddled his horse in silence, his movements swift and sure. He didn't take the main road, but cut through the chaparral, the sagebrush tearing at his trousers, as his horse moved like a phantom through the night. He reached the homestead well ahead of the thugs, tethering his horse in a copse of cottonwoods and circling around to the well. It sat near the back of the house, a simple stone structure with a wooden bucket on a rope. The lights in the house were dark. Helen and Rosie were asleep, unaware of the danger slinking toward them. He didn't have to wait long. Jeb and Silas dismounted a short distance away, moving with a clumsy stealth that betrayed their overconfidence. They carried a heavy glass jug filled with a viscous dark liquid. Tex watched from the deeper darkness of a tool shed as they approached the well. "Hurry it up," Jeb hissed, uncorking the jug. The foul chemical scent of arsenic drifted on the night air. "Don't want to be here when the sun comes up." "Keep your shirt on," Silas grumbled, grabbing the bucket rope. "She'll be begging to sell by week's end. Crenshaw's a genius, I tell you." Tex moved. He was not a shadow now, but a sudden terrifying storm. He stepped out of the shed, the moonlight glinting off the barrel of his Colt. "I believe that water is spoken for," he said, his voice a low growl that froze both men in their tracks. They spun around their hands, flying to their own holstered guns, but they were too slow. Tex was a different class of predator. Before either man could clear leather, the butt of his pistol crashed down on Silas's wrist with a sickening crack of bone. Silas screamed and stumbled back, clutching his shattered hand. Jeb, seeing his partner disabled, made a desperate lunge for the jug of poison. Tex's boot lashed out, connecting squarely with the man's chest and sending him sprawling into the dirt. The jug flew from his grasp, arcing through the air before shattering against the stone base of the well. The dark liquid soaked into the ground, a safe distance from the water source. "You're Crenshaw's man." Jeb spat, scrambling backward like a crab. "What are you doing?" "Changing my mind," Tex said. He stood over them, a towering silhouette of judgment. He could kill them both. It would be easy. The old Tex wouldn't have hesitated. But the memory of Rosie's face stayed his hand. This wasn't about killing anymore. It was about protecting. He kicked their guns away into the tall grass. "Get on your horses. Ride back to Crenshaw and tell him the well is secure. Tell him you were run off by a ghost." "I don't care what you tell him. But if I ever see either of you near this family again, I will finish what I've started here tonight." He punctuated the threat by firing a single shot into the dirt between Jeb's feet. The man yelped and scurried away, dragging the whimpering Silas with him. They mounted their horses and galloped off into the darkness, leaving Tex alone in the silent yard. A light flickered on in the house. A moment later, the back door opened a crack, and Helen McKinnon peered out, a shotgun held firmly in her hands. "Who's out there?" Tex melted back into the shadows before she could see him clearly. He had saved them, but he couldn't let them know. His protection had to remain a secret. It was the only way to keep them safe from Crenshaw, and the only way to continue his own dangerous masquerade. But as he rode away, a new complicated problem emerged. He had saved their well, but the broken jug was evidence of a failed attempt. Crenshaw would know, and he would want to know why his best man hadn't reported it. More pressingly, the family was now without a safe water source until he could be sure no poison had seeped in. He had to find a way to help them, to provide for them, without ever letting them know who their guardian angel was. The path to vengeance had suddenly become a tightrope walk of protection and deception. The lie he told Crenshaw was thin but plausible. He claimed he'd been making a final patrol of the town's perimeter when he'd seen two drifters near the McKinnon well. He'd run them off, he explained, and in their haste, they'd dropped and broken a bottle of cheap whiskey. Crenshaw listened, his expression unreadable, but the subtle tightening of his jaw told Tex he didn't fully believe the story. The seeds of suspicion were planted. For the next week, Tex lived a double life. By day he was Crenshaw's enforcer, the silent threat that kept Silver Ridge in line. By night, he became a ghost. Under the cover of darkness, he would haul fresh water from a hidden spring deep in the hills, leaving 2 full canteens on the McKinnons' back porch before dawn. He moved in silence, leaving no tracks of phantom benefactor. He would watch from a distance as Helen found the canteens, her expression a mixture of confusion and cautious relief. She never saw him, but he saw her, and in her resilience, he saw a reflection of the wife he had lost. This nocturnal ritual began to change him. The simple physical act of providing for a family, of protecting them, stirred embers of the man he once was. He began to investigate Crenshaw's operations more closely, no longer just a patient predator waiting for his moment, but a man growing suspicious of the depths of his enemy's depravity. The railroad deal felt like more than just a power grab. There was a desperation to Crenshaw's desire for the McKinnon land, specifically an urgency that felt personal. His quiet inquiries led him to Sheriff Dalton. The lawman of Silver Ridge was a hollowed-out shell of a man, his authority long since eroded by Crenshaw's influence. He spent most of his days staring into a whiskey glass, his badge a tarnished mockery of the duty he'd sworn to uphold. Tex found him in the saloon, after hours the only 2 souls in the cavernous room. "Crenshaw," Tex said, sitting down at Dalton's table without invitation. "Tell me about James McKinnon." Dalton flinched at the name. He took a long swallow of whiskey before speaking. "Good man. My deputy. Too good for this town." He started looking into the titles for the land Crenshaw was buying. Said something didn't add up. Found discrepancies, old claims that didn't match the deeds Crenshaw was producing. And Tex pressed. "And then he got sick." Dalton said, his eyes avoiding Tex's. "A fever. Came on fast. Doctor said it was his heart. I say it was a convenient diagnosis." The sheriff finally looked at Tex, a flicker of the man he might have been in his bloodshot eyes. "Crenshaw owns the doctor just like he owns this town. Just like he owns me." "He doesn't have to," Tex said quietly. Dalton let out a bitter laugh. "Easy for you to say. You're his right hand." "Hands can be cut off," Tex replied, leaving a gold eagle on the table to cover the sheriff's drink. He walked out, leaving Dalton to stare at the coin, a seed of rebellion planted in the barren soil of his courage. Tex's new purpose also led him to an old prospector named Jedediah, a man who lived in a shack in the hills and was rumored to know every rock stream and secret the land held. Tex found him panning for gold in a shallow creek. "That McKinnon land, Tex, started getting straight to the point. What's so special about it?" Jedediah squinted at him, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. "You Crenshaw's man." "Why should I tell you anything?" "Because Crenshaw wants it bad enough to kill for it. I want to know why." The prospector seemed to weigh Tex's words, his gaze sharp and discerning. "It ain't the land," he finally said, swirling the water in his pan. "It's what's under it. The old Silver Creek runs underground right beneath that homestead. Dries up before it gets to town, but down deep it's still flowing. And it's carrying more than just water. He swirled the pan one last time, revealing a half-dozen gleaming flecks at the bottom. Gold. Crenshaw ain't building a railroad. He's planning a gold mine, and he needs the water rights that come with that specific parcel of land to make it work. The pieces began to fit together. This wasn't about progress. It was about greed on a scale Tex hadn't imagined. Crenshaw was trying to steal a fortune from right under the town's nose. During this time, his secret encounters with Rosie continued. He would find her in the woods behind her house, where she went to gather wildflowers and carving wood. She was never afraid of him. She would simply sit near him, working on her small wooden animals, and talk. She told him about her father, about the stories he used to tell, and the way he taught her to carve. She reminded him so painfully of Lucy. The way she tilted her head when she was concentrating the smudge of dirt on her cheek, she was unaware of the unwavering belief that the world was fundamentally good. The guilt of his deception was a constant gnawing ache. He was protecting her, yes, but he was still the instrument of the man who wanted to destroy her home. To assuage that guilt, he began to tell her stories. He couldn't tell her about his own past, so he told her about a brave lawman he once knew, a man who always fought for what was right, who believed justice was more than just a word. He wove tales of courage and honor, describing a hero who protected the weak and stood up to the powerful. He realized with a jolt, describing his former self. He was rebuilding his own forgotten morality piece by piece through the stories he told a little girl who looked at him as if he were already that hero. "That lawman sounds like my daddy," Rosie said one afternoon, holding up a newly finished carving of a wolf. "He was a lot like your daddy," Tex said, his voice thick. The more he learned about Crenshaw's scheme, and the more time he spent in Rosie's innocent presence, the heavier his own lies became. He was walking a razor's edge. One side was the vengeance he had sought for 5 years. The other was the new fragile sense of purpose this family had given him. He knew a choice was coming, a moment when he would have to decide between the ghost he was avenging and the living child who was saving his soul. That moment came sooner than he expected. He needed proof of Crenshaw's plans, something tangible to show Dalton, something to turn the tide. That night, he decided to break into Crenshaw's office. The lock on the town hall's back entrance was old and simple. Tex had it open in seconds. He moved through the darkened building with a predator's silence, his boots making no sound on the wooden floors. Crenshaw's office was opulent, dominated by the massive desk and shelves lined with leather-bound books that Tex knew he never read. He was looking for land deeds maps, anything that would expose the gold mining operation. He worked quickly, checking the desk drawers first. They held contracts, letters, the mundane paperwork of Crenshaw's legitimate businesses. Nothing. He moved to a large iron safe in the corner. It was formidable, but Tex had learned many dark arts in his 5-year quest. He worked the dial with practiced fingers, listening to the delicate fall of the tumblers. The heavy door swung open with a well-oiled whisper. Inside were stacks of banknotes, geological surveys, and the forged land titles Dalton had suspected. This was the proof he needed. But as he reached for the documents, his fingers brushed against something else, a small wooden box tucked away in the back. It was not a strong box for money, but a personal keepsake box made of polished mahogany. Curiosity, a dangerous and unfamiliar impulse, made him pull it out. He opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, lay a simple silver locket. The world stopped turning. The air in his lungs turned to ice. It was hers, Margaret's. He knew its every detail, the small, scrolling engraving of an M on the front, the tiny, almost invisible scratch near the clasp where Lucy had dropped it once as a baby. His fingers, numb and trembling, reached for it. He pressed the hidden catch, and it sprang open. The tiny, hand-painted portraits of himself and Lucy stared up at him from across the years, their smiles a testament to a life that had been stolen. Silas Crenshaw, the leader of the gang in Harmony Creek, the man who had ripped this locket from his wife's cooling body, the architect of his life's defining agony. And for 5 years, Tex had been his right hand, his enforcer, his monster. The shock was a physical blow, a white-hot agony that eclipsed every pain he had ever known. He had served his greatest enemy. He had helped the man who murdered his wife consolidate his power, all while waiting for a sign that had been right in front of him, hidden in a box for half a decade. The irony was so profound, so cruelly perfect, that a strangled sound, half laugh, half sob, escaped his lips. The rage that followed was nothing like the cold, patient anger he had nurtured for years. This was a volcanic eruption, a pure, elemental fury that threatened to consume him whole. He wanted to storm into Crenshaw's room and tear him apart with his bare hands. But then an image floated through the red haze of his anger, Rosie holding out a wooden horse. "You look sad." The rage receded, leaving behind a terrifying clarity. Killing Crenshaw now would be too easy, too quick. It would not be justice. Justice was dismantling the man's entire empire, exposing him for the fraud and murderer he was, and protecting the innocent people he was trying to destroy. His quest for vengeance had just transformed. It was no longer a personal vendetta. It was a war for the soul of Silver Ridge, and for his own. He carefully placed the locket in his pocket, its cool metal a burning brand against his skin. He took the forged deeds and the geological surveys. The hunt was over. The fight had just begun. Crenshaw knew the moment Tex walked into his office the next morning. It wasn't anything Tex said or did. It was the stillness about him, the coiled intensity in his eyes, that had replaced the familiar, hollow emptiness. The predator in Crenshaw recognized a challenge from a rival. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Thomas," Crenshaw said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "I have," Tex replied, his voice level. "Mine." The conversation was short, laden with unspoken threats. Tex resigned, claiming he was tired of the work. Crenshaw accepted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, wishing him well with a chilling sincerity. Both men knew the game had changed. The masquerade was over. Crenshaw moved with brutal speed. That same afternoon, old Jedediah the prospector was found dead in his shack. The official story provided by Crenshaw's pet doctor was a heart attack. But Sheriff Dalton, spurred to action by the documents Tex had secretly passed to him, went to the scene himself. He found the old man's neck bruised and his shack ransacked. It was murder. The trap was sprung that evening. Dalton, his spine finally stiffened, with a long dormant sense of duty, went to confront Crenshaw. Tex, knowing Crenshaw would anticipate such a move, followed at a distance. As he watched from the shadows across the street, 2 of Crenshaw's men dragged a beaten Sheriff Dalton from the town hall and threw him into one of his own jail cells. Crenshaw had staged a coup. Then came the masterstroke. Crenshaw's men began spreading the word through the saloon, the general store, every corner of the town. Jedediah had been murdered during a robbery, and the killer was Tex. The motive, the prospector, had a secret stash of gold. The proof, Crenshaw produced a witness, a paid-off drifter, who swore he saw Tex leaving the shack. And then the final damning piece of evidence, a silver locket which Crenshaw claimed Jedediah had kept with his gold, now found in Tex's abandoned room at the boarding house. The locket. His locket. Crenshaw had planted it, twisting the ultimate symbol of Tex's grief into the instrument of his downfall. The town, already primed by years of fear, easily believed it. The monster they had always dreaded had finally shown his true colors. Sheriff Dalton was forced at gunpoint to sign a warrant for the arrest of Thomas "Tex" Brennan for the murder of Jedediah. Tex was now a fugitive, hunted by the very law he was trying to restore, and by the full force of Crenshaw's private army. His reputation, the tool he had so carefully honed, had been turned against him. In the eyes of Silver Ridge, he was no longer a mysterious threat. He was a common killer. His only allies were a disgraced sheriff locked in his own jail and a small girl who still believed he was a hero. He had to get to Helen and Rosie to warn them. Crenshaw would see them as his last piece of leverage. Tex slipped through the back alleys of the town he now knew so well, a ghost moving through the town that had declared him its enemy. He reached the McKinnon homestead just as Crenshaw's men were arriving. He watched from the darkness as they surrounded the small house, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. He was outnumbered, wounded by the town's betrayal, and trapped. His quest for justice had cornered him, and the very people he was trying to save were now in the direct line of fire. The storm came from the west, a roiling wall of sand and fury that swallowed the horizon. It was a fitting backdrop for the coming apocalypse. Inside the McKinnon house, Tex explained the situation to Helen in low, urgent tones. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady as she loaded her husband's shotgun. Rosie, her eyes wide, clutched the wooden horse Tex had returned to her. She didn't understand everything, but she understood that the man she called her friend was in trouble, and that the bad men were outside. "He will not have this house," Helen said, her voice a steel wire. "He will not have my daughter." Crenshaw didn't wait long. As the first gusts of wind began to lash the small house, he sent one of his men forward with a white flag and a message. He wanted Rosie. He would hold her until Helen signed the deed. If she refused, he would burn the house to the ground, with all of them inside. It was a move of pure theatrical cruelty. Tex looked at Helen, saw the terror warring with defiance in her eyes. "There's only one place he'd take her," Tex said. "A place where the whole town can watch. The church." The church stood on a low hill at the end of Main Street, its steeple a lonely finger pointing to a wrathful sky. It had been abandoned for years, but Crenshaw knew the power of symbols. He would make his last stand on holy ground. The plan was desperate. While Crenshaw's men were focused on the house, Tex would slip out the back and circle around to the church. Helen would give them a fight, buying him as much time as she could. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only option they had. Before he left, Rosie ran to him and pressed a small, newly carved wooden bird into his hand. "To help you fly," she whispered. He closed his hand around it, the simple gift, a fragile shield against the coming darkness. The sandstorm hit with full force as Tex ran, the wind tearing at him, the sand scouring his skin. It provided the perfect cover. He reached the church undetected and slipped in through a broken window in the back. The interior was a cavern of shadows and dust. Flickering lanterns placed by Crenshaw's men cast long, menacing shadows that danced like devils on the walls. A large clock on the wall ticked with an oppressive loudness, each second a hammer blow counting down to the deadline. Crenshaw arrived moments later, dragging Rosie by the arm. He was no longer the polished businessman. The storm and the fight had stripped away his veneer, revealing the raw, ugly ambition beneath. He shoved Rosie toward the altar, where two of his men stood guard. The final act, Thomas Crenshaw shouted over the howl of the wind. "A tragedy of your own making." Just then the church doors burst open. But it wasn't Helen. It was Sheriff Dalton, his face bruised, but his eyes blazing. Beside him stood a dozen men from the town, Mr. Hawkins, with his shotgun ranchers with their rifles, even Big Mike from the saloon. Helen's stand at the homestead had been a diversion, a rallying cry. While Crenshaw's attention was on her, she had slipped into town and freed the sheriff, galvanizing the very people who had condemned Tex hours before. They had chosen a side. "It's over, Crenshaw," Dalton said, his voice ringing with newfound authority. Crenshaw laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. He grabbed Rosie, pulling her in front of him as a shield, a pistol pressed to her temple. "It's over when I say it is." Tex stepped out from behind the pulpit, his own gun leveled at Crenshaw. "Let the girl go, Silas." The standoff was absolute. Two men, their faces illuminated by the flickering lanterns, the howling wind their only chorus. Rosie stood between them, terrified but silent. "This is all because of you," Thomas Crenshaw roared, his eyes wild with a grief that looked terrifyingly like madness. "You and your stubborn pride. You couldn't just leave well enough alone. This is about your greed." Tex countered, taking a slow step forward. "The gold. The water rights." Gold. Crenshaw's laughter was a raw, wounded cry. "You think this was about gold? This was never about gold." He tightened his grip on Rosie, his knuckles white. "This was about her nice sister." The words hung in the air, more shocking than any gunshot. "What did you say?" Tex breathed. "Margaret. My baby sister." Crenshaw's face contorted, the mask of the villain falling away to reveal a man shattered by loss. "Our parents died when she was just a girl. I raised her. I protected her. She was supposed to have a good life, a safe life back east. But she fell in love with a lawman, a man who promised her adventure and then got tired of the risk. The revelation reframed everything. The bank robbery, the stolen locket. It was never random. You took her from a safe life." Crenshaw screamed, tears carving paths through the grime on his face. "You dragged her out to this godforsaken dust bowl, quit your post, and left her exposed. You buried her in the dirt, so I came to bury you in yours. The robbery was to make you feel what I felt, the helplessness, the loss. I wanted to take everything from you, just like you took everything from me." The world tilted on its axis. This was not a story of good versus evil. It was a tragic family drama, a war between two men, broken by the same death, each blaming the other. Tex saw not a monster, but a man twisted into a grotesque shape by a grief as profound as his own. The realization did not soften him. It focused him. This man's pain did not give him the right to threaten another child, to perpetuate the cycle of violence. "You dishonor her memory," Silas. Tex said, his voice quiet but carrying over the storm. "Margaret believed in goodness, in hope. Look what your grief has made you." For a second, Crenshaw faltered. His grip on Rosie loosened. In that instant, Tex moved. He didn't shoot. He lunged, closing the distance between them, his body a shield for Rosie. At the same moment, Dalton and the townsmen opened fire on Crenshaw's two guards, who fell in a hail of righteous gunfire. Tex slammed into Crenshaw, spinning him around and away from Rosie. They crashed against the altar, two men locked in a desperate final struggle. Crenshaw's gun went off the bullet, tearing harmlessly through the church roof. Tex brought his own pistol down, not to shoot, but as a club, striking Crenshaw's hand and sending the revolver skittering across the floor. The fight was brutal, primal. It was not a gunfight, but a brawl fueled by years of shared, festering grief. They traded blows, each punch a release of pain and rage. Finally, Tex landed a blow that sent Crenshaw staggering back. The man was defeated, his plans in ruins, his twisted justification exposed. He looked at Tex, his eyes empty. "She's gone," he whispered, "and it's all your fault." Before Tex or Dalton could stop him, Crenshaw made one last desperate choice. He lunged not for a weapon, but for a fallen lantern, and hurled it into a pile of dry hymn books. Flames erupted with a hungry roar, spreading instantly up the dry wooden walls of the old church. The fight was over. Now they had to survive. As flames consumed the church, Tex grabbed Rosie, shielding her with his body, as he and the townsfolk scrambled for the exit. Crenshaw remained behind, a solitary figure, silhouetted against the inferno, his laughter mixing with the roar of the fire as the roof began to collapse. He had chosen to be consumed by the hatred that had driven him for so long. Outside, the sandstorm began to die down as quickly as it had arrived. The wind lessened, and through a break in the clouds, the first rays of dawn broke through, illuminating the scene in a soft, forgiving light. The townspeople stood in stunned silence, watching the church burn, a fiery pyre for the darkness that had haunted their town. Sheriff Dalton walked over to Tex, clapping a hand on his shoulder. In front of the assembled citizens of Silver Ridge, he spoke, his voice clear and strong. "Thomas Brennan is no murderer. He was framed by the man who truly poisoned this town. As of this moment, his name is cleared of all charges. A quiet murmur of relief and agreement went through the crowd. Helen rushed forward, pulling Rosie into a fierce embrace. She looked up at Tex, her eyes filled with a gratitude that needed no words. He was wounded, bruised, and covered in soot, but he was alive. He knelt down in front of Rosie. Her face was smudged with ash, but her eyes were clear. He opened his hand and showed her the small wooden bird she had given him. It was unscathed. Then he pulled the horse she had first offered him from his other pocket. "I think this belongs to you," he said gently. Rosie shook her head, pushing it back into his hand. "No," she said, her voice small but firm. "It's yours. It helped you be brave." She wrapped her small arms around his neck, a gesture of pure, unconditional acceptance. Tex held her, and for the first time since he had buried his own daughter, he felt the possibility of a future. Months later, Silver Ridge was a town reborn. The blackened skeleton of the church had been cleared away, and in its place, the foundations of a new town hall and schoolhouse were being laid. The spirit of cooperation forged in the heat of that final battle had taken root. Tex, now officially Deputy Brennan, wore James McKinnon's tarnished silver badge with a quiet sense of honor. He had found a new purpose, not in vengeance, but in service. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent now, replaced by the sounds of children's laughter and the steady rhythm of a town rebuilding itself. The final scene of his old life played out in the town cemetery. He stood before a new grave marker, a simple stone of polished granite he had carved himself. It read, "Margaret and Lucy Brennan, beloved." He had brought them here, moving their remains from the lonely grave outside Harmony Creek to be part of his new home. He had placed their marker next to the grave of James McKinnon. It felt right, two good men resting beside the families they had fought to protect. He took the silver locket from his pocket. For months, it had been a source of pain, a reminder of all he had lost and the terrible path he had walked. Now it was just a memory, a beautiful, sad keepsake of a love that had once defined him. He gently placed it on the stone of Margaret's grave, a final letting go. Then he reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small, newly carved wooden horse, a gift from Rosie. He placed it carefully on the side of the stone dedicated to Lucy. It was a trade, exchanging a symbol of a past haunted by revenge for a symbol of a future guided by hope. He stood for a long moment, the quiet peace of the cemetery settling over him. He was no longer Tex, the specter of vengeance. He was Thomas Brennan, a father who had found a new way to honor his family's memory by embracing life, by protecting the innocent, and by allowing his broken heart to heal. As he turned to walk away, he saw Helen and Rosie waiting for him by the cemetery gate. Rosie waved her smile as bright as the morning sun. Helen simply watched him, her expression one of quiet understanding and shared hope. He walked toward them, leaving the ghosts of his past to rest. Their shared look, full of unspoken promises and the quiet acknowledgement of a new beginning, suggested the mending of three broken souls into the tentative shape of a new family. He had found his way home.